This video is going to cover making texture mods using the Frosty Editor. I'm going to be focusing mostly on how to use Frosty itself rather than how to make proper game textures. To be honest, I'm not much of an expert when it comes to textures, so I might say some things that are wrong, but I'll try my best. First of all, let's make it easier to find textures by typing type:"texture asset" in the search bar. Then let's take a look at some of Faith's textures, shall we? Those are in characters, Faith, and we'll have a look at the upper body textures for now. So this is the texture viewer. You can't modify the texture directly in here. You have to export it, make your modifications in some other image manipulation software, and then re-import it. At the top you can toggle the different color channels: red, green, blue, and alpha. In the top right, you have the compression type, and more on that later. There's also a toggle to hide the checkerboard background, and this one which has a tooltip which describes what it does, which is overriding the display of linear data in gamma space. Usually this one will be enabled for textures which have sRGB in the compression type, and disabled for ones which have unorm in the compression type, like this one, for example. So next to that you have the MIP map level dropdown. MIPs are basically lower resolution versions of the texture that the game can load when an object is too small for you to appreciate the details of a higher resolution texture in order to improve performance. This pane on the right, honestly, you don't really need to worry about. I don't think I've ever actually touched it but it has some information about the texture. Just to be clear, these controls at the top are just for the viewer. They don't actually make any changes to the texture asset. So let's talk about texture channels briefly. If you have a texture which is used for color, like a diffuse texture such as this one, the red, green, and blue channels are used for just that, red, green, and blue color. But what does the alpha channel do? Well, it's clearly being used for something. It seems to add transparency in the viewer. But that's just how the viewer interprets the alpha channel. In reality, the alpha channel for this texture is used for ambient occlusion. In non-color textures, such as this NRS one, each of the channels, including the red, green, and blue ones, can be used for different purposes. In this case, the red and green channels are used together as a normal map. The blue channel is used for reflectance, meaning the lighter parts are more reflective. And the alpha channel is used for smoothness, with the lighter parts being smoother and the darker parts being rougher. Let's look at this texture that ends with an M next. This is basically used as a mask to apply generic material textures to certain parts of the model. Each channel represents a specific material, and the white areas are where the material should be applied. For example, the red channel clearly applies to the collar of the jacket. Sometimes you can infer what a texture is used for from the name of the asset, as they tend to use consistent naming conventions. So DAO stands for diffuse and ambient occlusion. NRS stands for normals, roughness, and smoothness. M might stand for materials or mask, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure about EX either, though looking at the arm textures, it could be used for subsurface scattering. There are ways we can figure out what each channel does though, if we're not sure. First, open up the mesh which uses these textures. Then go to the Variations tab and expand the Mesh Variation DBs category. So make a note of this index number, then click on the three dots on the Variation DB asset and click Open Asset. Now expand these entries and go find the one at that index that we made a note of before, which was 44. Now we can expand these materials and have a look at the texture parameters. So in here you can see the name of the parameter and the texture that was used for it. So this NRS file is used for normal and RS, which I happen to know is reflectance and smoothness. This EX texture that I wasn't sure about is used for opacity, SSS, which stands for subsurface scattering, metal, and trans. And I'm not sure what that's short for. It might be translucency or transmittance or something. The order that those are listed in probably line up with the RGBA channels. So you can see that this ARMS EX channel uses green, which was, as I thought, subsurface scattering. If I keep going through these, we have diffuse and ambient occlusion, this material mask, and then we have all of these material textures which are used in combination with the material mask to apply materials to certain parts of the mesh. I think the number in the material name, so 01 in this case, usually lines up with the channel that it applies to. So anything in channel 1, the red channel, will have these materials applied to it. Anyway, that's a really effective way to figure out what each texture does if you don't know. While we have this mesh open, I'm going to show you another cool feature of Frosty that can help you with your texture mods. First of all, obviously you can preview the textures in here without needing to launch the game. What's really cool though is this view mode dropdown. As you can see, you can preview the model with its various different texture components, such as normals, ambient occlusion, smoothness, metalness, and reflectance. So that can be really useful if you're modifying one of those. Finally, take a look at exporting this texture then. So to do that, we want to press the export button at the top. Frosty will ask you where you want to save the image, and it'll also let you choose from a variety of file formats to export it as. Under the hood, the game uses the DDS format, so if you use that, it'll export the original asset as is, giving you the best quality, but Frosty will automatically convert it to other formats if you choose those, but this can add compression or reduce the bit depth. The downside of DDS files is that they are harder to work with. For example, you need to install a plugin to work with them in Photoshop, and you need to make sure you get the export settings right. I will go over using DDS files for later, but for now I won't choose it. PNG, on the other hand, is a very widely supported file type, so it can be very easy to work with. The downside of PNG though is that it interprets the alpha channel as transparency, which is not always correct as we saw earlier. For that reason, it's really only useful for working with color textures that don't have any alpha. TGA is pretty easy to work with, at least in Photoshop, and has a separate alpha channel, so I find it a convenient format to use if I can't be bothered with the hassle of DDS. HDR, I assume, is for high dynamic range assets, which as far as I know is typically just cube maps and such, so I don't think you typically need to use it. So I'm going to go with TGA for now and save that file. I'll make a quick change to this texture in Photoshop before re-importing it, just so that we can see the difference. If you look at the Channels tab in Photoshop, you can see that it has the separate alpha channel like I mentioned earlier. Let's do a really basic color change and change the reds to blues. That's more like cyan, but whatever. Now I can save that. I will use TGA again, but I will change the name of the file so that I still have the original just in case. Now we can import our modded texture. You simply click on the import button at the top next to the export button we just used, select the file format that we want. We're using TGA, and then select your modded file. And there it is, there's our imported texture. It's now cyan. And a cool thing Frosty that just did for us without even realizing it is it automatically converted that TGA file to DDS with the correct compression type and generated all of the MIPs as well. The downside is that this can add some compression and therefore loss of quality, so it's best to work with DDS directly if you can. We can even now reopen that mesh and see our texture applied to it. You see it's now blue. I'm not going to actually bother launching the game to show it. You'll just have to trust me that it works, but I think you can see that it does. Now, I said that I would explain a bit more about how to use DDS files, so let's go over that briefly. First of all, the only way I know of to work with them is to use the Photoshop plugin. So sorry if you don't have Photoshop, but I can't help you unfortunately. On the Frosty Editor's homepage, there is a link to this Intel TextureWorks plugin for Photoshop. If you open that up, click Download Plugin, then click Download Zip, and it will download the plugin. Then you just want to extract the contents of that zip and follow the instructions in the README file that's in there to install the plugin. And once you've done that, you should be ready to work with DDS files. So let's revert that texture that we modded earlier and export it again, but this time we'll choose DDS. Then we'll open that in Photoshop, and you'll get this load options prompt. I usually have load transparency as alpha channel checked and load MIP maps into separate layers unchecked. As you can see, we have our separate channels for alpha and RGB, just like with TGA. So let's do that same mod as before and change the red to cyan. I'm just going to add the hue adjustment layer, select the reds channel and change the hue. Then I want to save as a different file name and make sure you have the Intel TextureWorks type selected. Then click save and we'll see this Intel TextureWorks window pop up. So let's go through each of these options to figure them out. First of all, texture type. This basically determines what compression options will be available. You should be able to figure this one out pretty easily based on what kind of texture you're editing. This isn't a normal map or a cube map. It's color, and we do have an alpha channel, so that's what we want. Next is the compression. Remember earlier when I pointed out the compression type in the top right of the texture viewer? This is where that comes into play. So for this texture, it's BC7 sRGB. There's a few BC7 options in here. These are the sRGB ones, and you have fast or fine, which I think is just quality basically. So I'm going to choose fine because that's the higher quality. For reference, if the texture was linear rather than sRGB, it would say BC7U norm in the top right in Frosty. The upper body NRS file is an example of that. So going back to the options, some of them are grayed out, so we can just skip those. For bitmaps, we should choose auto generate, and then we can simply click OK, and it's exported. Now we can go back into Frosty, click import, select the DDS type, select our modded file, and click open. And there it is, easy as that.